All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle open source software.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's everywhere these days, right? But how safe is it really? We've got this talk by Johnny Wong, a software engineering manager at
F5.
Yeah, F5. He gets into some of the security and management challenges.
They're a big name, F5.
Yeah,
At least in application security.
for sure. And Wong really doesn't hold back. Right out of the gate, he drops this stat. 38% of exploited vulnerabilities in just the first half of 2023
Wow.
were zero-day attacks. That's huge.
Yeah, 38%. That basically means attackers were finding and exploiting weaknesses that nobody even knew about yet.
No time for patches or fixes.
Exactly. And that's what makes 0 days so dangerous, right?
Yeah.
It's not just that the vulnerabilities are unknown. It's that they're often exploited because they're unknown.
Developers are scrambling, trying to catch up.
While the attackers are already in.
Right. And Wong gets some pretty scary real-world examples, ChatGPT, vulnerabilities that could spill data, and others that could give attackers like a backdoor into your network. Even let them take more control over your systems.
Not good.
No, not good at all. It makes you think twice, right? About just trusting open source just because it's popular.
Definitely. I mean, popularity doesn't equal security.
Nope. So why is open source so risky? Well, Wong lays out 6 reasons, and he uses this house building analogy.
Okay. I like analogies.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So picture this. You're trying to build a house, but all the materials are free, but there are no instructions and no quality checks.
That sounds risky.
It's like open source sometimes. You're excited about saving money at first, but
Then the problems start.
exactly.
Nah.
First, there's often no formal support. It's like building that house, but you're relying on your neighbors for help. They mean well, but they're not,
Licensed contractors.
Right. And then there's the whole problem of verifying every single piece.
Making sure it's all up to code.
Yeah, is that brick strong enough? Is that board going to hold up?
And with open source, you're usually pulling these pieces from different sources.
Like different suppliers.
Right, with their own standards, their own ways of doing things.
It's like grabbing ingredients from different grocery stores for a recipe without knowing where it all came from or how it was handled.
Oh yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So now we've got this recipe for disaster. Let's look at a specific example Wong uses. NGINX.
Oh yeah, NGINX.
It's a super popular open source web server. It powers something like 440 million websites.
Wow, 440 million. That's a lot.
It is, including 70% of the top 10,000 websites. It's a big deal.
Definitely a workhorse. I mean, it can be a web server, sure, but also a reverse proxy, a load balancer. It's like a Swiss Army knife for web prep.
Versatile. Yeah.
Super versatile.
But here's the thing. Imagine trying to manage NGINX when it's coming from everywhere.
Everywhere.
Different Linux distributions, official build, third-party packages, people compiling their own code.
Oh, that sounds like a mess.
It's like having a dozen slightly different versions of the same recipe and no clue which one's the official one.
Or even if any of them are safe.
Right. And that's where the open source model, while powerful, can get kind of hairy.
Yeah, that fragmentation can be a real headache.
So what's the solution? How do we deal with all this risk? Wong talks about the need for troops like solid support systems. He points to NGINX Plus, their enterprise-grade version.
Ah, so they've got a paid version.
They do. It offers enhanced security, advanced traffic management, and this thing called service resilience.
Sounds robust.
It is. It's like having that professional contractor we talked about earlier for our house.
Makes sense.
Instead of relying on your neighbor, you've got an expert.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, open source can be tough, so here's a more hand-holding version.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, is this just a clever upsell, or is the open source version really missing something crucial?
That's a great question.
It is something to think about for sure. Now, Wong also brings up API gateways.
Okay, API gateways. They're important these days.
He compares them to security guards, managing access at a big event, like a concert.
So controlling who comes in and out.
Making sure things flow smoothly.
And keeping things secure.
Yeah. So we've got troops for support, security guards with the API gateways. But how do we actually manage these increasingly complex deployments, especially when they involve a bunch of different parts, what Wong calls supercarriers?
Supercarriers. That sounds intense.
It does. It's not just one little NGINX instance anymore. It's like a fleet of them integrated with other systems spread across different environments.
It's a whole other ballgame.
It is. And for that, Wong suggests their NGINX management suite. It's like a central control panel for all your NGINX instances.
So you can see everything in one place.
You can track their health, deploy security policies, policies, manage configurations.
That sounds pretty powerful.
It is. It's like having that master chef overseeing all those different versions of the recipe, making sure everything's consistent and up to par.
Centralized management. It's definitely appealing. But is it realistic? Especially for smaller teams with limited resources, it seems like it could be overkill.
It's a great point. It's that balance between complexity and practicality, right? Something to consider as we go deeper. But for now, let's turn to another critical part of managing open source risk: security monitoring.
All right, security monitoring.
Wong stresses that it's not enough to just have your basic security measures in place. You need to be actively watching your applications for anything suspicious.
Like having a security detail that's not just standing guard, they're actively looking for threats.
Analyzing patterns, yeah.
Proactive, not reactive.
Exactly. And the tool he highlights is the security monitoring module for NGINX App Protect. He says it gives you centralized visibility and tons of insights into security events.
So you can see what's happening.
It's like having a security camera system that not only records everything, but analyzes it and tells you what's important.
Real-time threat detection.
Right. And Wong goes deep on this. The module can pinpoint top violations, analyze attack signatures, flag known vulnerabilities. Those are called CVEs.
CVEs.
Yeah. And even track specific threat campaigns. It's like having a team of cybersecurity analysts working around the clock to keep you safe.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
But how effective is it really? And is it accessible for everyone? Or just the big players with deep pockets?
Those are great questions, and ones we'll definitely explore further. So it seems like we're seeing a pattern here. With open source, you can't just focus on the free part. You got to think about the hidden costs, security, management, support.
Exactly. Juan's point.
Yeah.
You can't just rely on community support, especially for businesses where downtime or a security breach could be disastrous.
Right. The stakes are higher.
Way higher. It's like building a house with no blueprints.
Yeah.
You might get there eventually, but it's going to be a lot more painful, maybe dangerous.
And that's where having those troops comes in, right? Reliable enterprise-grade support.
Yeah, it's like having architects and engineers on call, ready to answer questions, troubleshoot problems. You're paying for their expertise, but it could save you a ton of time and money in the long run.
So it's a whole different way of thinking about it. Open source isn't just the code, it's the whole ecosystem around it.
Support systems, management tools, security experts, the whole package.
And that's even more crucial now because companies are building crazy complex applications using open source.
Oh yeah, the stakes are higher than ever.
And that's where Wong's supercarriers idea really hits home. We're not talking about one little NGINX instance anymore.
Right, it's way bigger than that.
We're talking about managing fleets of them, integrated with other systems across all these different environments.
It's like managing a fleet of ships, not just one sailboat.
Exactly. You need a serious command center, the right navigation tools, a highly skilled crew.
It's a whole different level of complexity.
It is. So you need the right tools to handle that, right? Like that NGINX management suite we talked about.
It's one way to go, for sure. That centralized control and visibility is definitely appealing.
Seems powerful.
It does. But I'm still wondering about practicality, especially for smaller teams. Do they really need all that? Could it be overkill?
It's a valid question. It goes back to what we were saying about cost and complexity, right? We need to dig into what's realistic for different organizations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While we're at it, maybe we should revisit those 6 reasons for open source risk that Wong laid out.
Yeah, let's unpack those a bit more. We talked about that first one, the lack of formal support. How big of a deal is that really? And can you fix it without paying for an enterprise solution?
Well, it really depends, on the component itself and how important it is to your system. If it's mission critical, relying on community forums or Stack Overflow might not be enough.
So what are the alternatives? Besides paying, of course.
Well, some companies train their own engineers to become specialists in certain open source components.
Building in-house expertise.
Right. Others team up with other companies or industry groups to pool resources.
So there's strength in numbers.
Exactly. You could also hire a consulting firm that specializes in a particular open source project.
So there are options. It's not always pay up or go without.
Right. It's about finding the right approach for your situation.
Okay, what about Wong's second point? The difficulty of verifying the security of every single component. That sounds tough.
It is. Remember, this is software built from tons of different pieces, often written by different people, with different levels of security awareness.
It's like building a house where each brick comes from a different supplier, and you have no idea if they're all safe.
A recipe for disaster, yeah.
So how do you even start to deal with that? Do you have to become a security expert in everything you use?
Well, no, not really. There are tools to help with that. One approach is using something called software composition analysis tools, or SCA tools.
SCA tools, what do they do?
They scan your code and tell you exactly what open source components you're using, what versions, and any known vulnerabilities.
So they're like an inspector checking each brick for weaknesses.
Exactly. SCA tools give you a much clearer picture of your risk. But tools aren't enough on their own. You also need to stay updated on security patches and updates for everything you use.
That sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It can be, especially if you're using a lot of different components. And that brings us to another point Wong made: inconsistent sources.
Right. You might be getting components from all over the place.
Official websites, third-party package managers, individual developers, who knows? And they all have different security practices, different update schedules.
Like trying to track down the origin and safety of every ingredient in a complicated dish.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity. That's why it's so important to have clear policies and procedures in place.
So you know what's allowed and what's not.
Exactly. For example, you might decide to only use open source components from trusted sources, like official repositories or vendors with a good track record.
Being selective, yeah.
Right. Choose your ingredients carefully.
Makes sense. Now, before we move on to proactive security monitoring, I wanted to go back to the NGINX example. We were talking about managing those supercarriers, those complex open source deployments.
Right, those huge systems.
You were worried that solutions like the NGINX management suite might be too much for smaller organizations?
Too complex, too expensive, yeah.
Did Wong address that at all? Did he offer any alternatives?
He did, briefly. He still thinks comprehensive suites are great, but he knows they're not for everyone. He says even smaller teams can benefit from some of the core principles of centralized management.
Okay, like what?
Well, even if you can't afford a whole suite, you can still set up centralized logging and monitoring for your open source components.
So you can see everything that's happening in one place.
Exactly. That way you can spot problems and respond to incidents more quickly.
Finding that balance between robust solutions and what's actually doable.
Right. And that brings us back to proactive security monitoring, staying ahead of the curve instead of just reacting to problems.
Okay, let's talk about that. What are the key things companies should be doing to proactively monitor their open source stuff?
First things first, you got to know what's happening in your systems. You need comprehensive logging and monitoring that can capture and analyze data from all your open source components.
We touched on that earlier. What
Right.
kind of data are we talking about, and what are we looking for?
We're looking for anything out of the ordinary, anything that might be a security threat. Unusual login attempts, spikes in resource usage, weird network traffic, people trying to access sensitive data.
Like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Pretty much. And that's where tools like intrusion detection systems or IDSs and security information and event management systems or SIMs come in handy.
They can analyze all that data.
They can, in real time, looking for patterns and correlations that might signal an attack.
So we're talking about a lot of data. How do you avoid getting overwhelmed? Do you need a whole team just to watch all this stuff?
That's where automation and smart alerts come in. Modern security tools are designed to filter out the noise and only alert you to the really important things.
So you're not drowning in information.
Exactly. And this is where machine learning and AI are starting to make a difference.
AI and security.
Oh yeah. They can help analyze data more efficiently, spot complex attack patterns, and even automate responses to some types of threats.
Sounds pretty powerful. But you'd need some serious expertise to set that up, right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to keep training your security teams. The threat landscape is always changing, and so are the tools and techniques to defend against it.
So staying ahead of the curve is a constant process.
It is. Organizations need to invest in their security teams to make sure they've got the skills and knowledge to keep up.
All right, so we've covered a lot, from verifying the security of open source components to proactive monitoring, advanced security tools.
It's clear that managing open source risk is complicated. It takes technical expertise, strategic planning, and a culture of security awareness.
No easy answers.
Nope. Companies need to figure out what works best for them based on their needs, their resources, and how much risk they're willing to take.
Tailoring the approach.
Right. As we keep going with Wong's talk, I'm curious to see if he has any specific advice on how to do that.
Okay, so we've talked about the what of open source risk, the challenges, the tools, all that. But what about the how? How do you actually manage this stuff in the real world?
Yeah, how do you actually put it all into practice?
What are the concrete steps?
Well, Wong has some good advice here. He says it starts with knowing what you're dealing with.
Like inventory.
Exactly. You'd be surprised how many companies don't even know what open source components they're using.
Or what versions or where they came from.
Right, it's like trying to run a kitchen without knowing what ingredients you have.
Or how old they are.
Exactly. So step one is getting that inventory. But it's not just a list, you know? You got to understand how each component fits in your system, what it depends on, and any potential risks.
So it's like inventory plus a risk assessment?
Yeah, pretty much. Once you have that,
Okay.
you can start prioritizing what's mission critical, what has known vulnerabilities, what's most likely to get attacked.
Okay, so you've figured out your riskiest ingredients. What's next?
Now you got to figure out how to deal with them. And this is where it gets tricky because there's no one right answer.
Depends on the situation.
Totally. Depends on the components, the risk, and your company's overall risk tolerance.
So what are some of the options?
Well, one option is patching, fixing vulnerabilities. If there's a security flaw in something you're using, the developers will often release a patch to fix it.
Keeping things updated.
Right, that's crucial. Another option is upgrading to a newer version. Sometimes newer versions have better security built in.
So staying on top of updates is key. But what if there's no patch or no newer version? What if the vulnerability is just still there?
That's tough. In some cases, you might be able to work around it, put up some extra defenses. For example, you might block traffic to the vulnerable component with your firewall. Or you might add extra authentication to protect sensitive data.
Like putting a Band-Aid on it?
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best solution is just to replace the whole thing.
With something more secure.
Right. And maybe a different open source project or even a commercial solution that's more robust.
So you've got patching, upgrading, working around, replacing. What about preventing those vulnerabilities in the first place?
Now you're talking. Wong's a big believer in secure coding practices. He says developers need to understand the risks of using open source code and learn how to write code that minimizes those risks.
So it's about baking security into the development process from the start.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual developers. It's about creating a whole culture of security within the company.
What does that look like?
Well, it means having clear security policies, regular training for developers, and good communication between development and security teams.
Breaking down silos.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important point, community engagement.
Community engagement. How does that help with security?
Well, remember, open source is all about collaboration, right?
Yeah.
By getting involved with the open source community, companies can access a ton of knowledge and experience.
Learning from each other.
Right. Participating in forums, helping with security audits, reporting vulnerabilities, even just keeping up with the latest trends, it all makes a difference.
It's like a collective effort to make open source safer for everyone.
Exactly. And it's not just about being nice, it's in everyone's best interest. A vulnerability in one project can affect tons of others.
It's all interconnected.
It is. So managing open source risk means looking at the big picture. It's not just about technical solutions, it's about people, processes, and culture.
So to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways here? What do we want our listeners to remember?
I think the main takeaway is this. Open source is awesome, but it has its dangers. You got to be smart about it.
Proactive, vigilant.
Exactly. And you can't do it alone. Collaboration and knowledge sharing are key.
Be informed, be prepared, be part of the solution.
Couldn't have said it better myself. As you continue to explore the world of open source, remember to do it safely. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay secure.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful. Keep exploring, keep learning, and stay curious out there.